Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. A quiet question, a strange idea, and a soft journey into a world that never was. So if you are ready, maybe dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us ease into tonight's story together. The year is 1841, and the air above London hums with the warmth of a distant idea. A man named George Grimsby finishes soldering a switchboard the size of a tea table. He does not invent anything that night, but he closes a circuit that will never open again. Beneath the banks of the Thames, copper wires stretch between two brick vaults, not just with a code, but with a kind of language that did not care about distance or accent or handwriting. A woman named Elise Charvet became the first person to route messages between three cities in one day. The Prussians loved order and kept detailed logs. Operators were trained in polytechnic schools, where they learned logic and mechanical systems side by side. The word handshaking entered the language. It meant checking identity and opening a connection. The whole process was quiet and polite. Journalists started tapping into the network, one to encode and one to decode. It was delicate work. The timing of each pulse had to be exact. Even half a second off, and the system would reject the signal. Operators developed thick calluses from pressing the input pads. Schools began teaching the basics. Some installed training boards alongside chalk slates and abacuses. In Hamburg, a 13-year-old girl named Greta Weiss broke a routing record. She relayed 13 messages across 3 countries in under 2 hours. Her father was a machinist. He built her a custom dial for her birthday. One printer in Soho, named Charles Elbridge, wired a hidden relay to his neighbor's coil. At night, he read the messages as they came in. He compiled the best ones and printed a small leaflet called the Wire Digest. It contained intercepted messages, market prices, and rumors. It sold quickly, too quickly. Within weeks, operators started using simple substitution ciphers to protect messages. Privacy had become a concern, very Victorian. The network was not called the Internet, not yet. They called it the wire. She worked 12 hours without looking up from her station. A nearby oil lamp hissed softly and lit the logbook. They were merchants and factory owners and stockbrokers, people who needed quick answers and hated delays. Grain traders in Liverpool could plan shipments with buyers in Bordeaux. Railway companies updated schedules and reported cargo arrivals through the wire. The system saved hours, sometimes days. One message could stop a shipment or save a warehouse full of produce from spoiling. Soon, stations appeared in warehouses around Manchester. Clerks began every day by checking the inbound tray. Each tape held a timestamp and a sender's mark. Its pages were marked with wax seals and old coffee stains. Elise knew more than 100 network addresses. Some went to schools or courthouses. Some led to naval offices or private clubs. She never saw the people she connected, but she remembered their patterns. Some sent long essays, word by word. Others only sent strange codes and flags. Elise never asked what they meant. She just kept the time and cleared the buffer. Morse had shown that electricity could carry meaning. But in this version of history, something shifted. A German physicist, forgotten in our world, but remembered in this one, chose to take things further. Sometimes 2 packets reached a relay at the same time. They would clash and cancel each other out. Operators could hear the soft double pulse of a collision and would pause the line. They would reset the switches and send again. It was slow but reliable, and because everything was physical, people trusted it. You could hear the brass modules click as the message moved along. You could watch the dial spin, and when the tape came out, it was still warm in your hand. His name was Dietrich Albrecht, and he believed messages should do more than travel. He believed they should find their way. They were laid down by hand, foot after foot, inch after inch, then sealed with pitch and soot. The men who buried them did not know what they were building. They only knew they were told to keep them dry. It starts with a click, or maybe a pulse, something you would not notice unless you were listening for it. A few streets away, in a quiet room near Charing Cross, years earlier, Samuel Morse had already laid the foundation. He imagined small mechanical devices no more complex than the inner parts of a clock. Machines that could listen to incoming pulses and forward them based on a set address. A kind of thinking switchboard made of gears and brass. They called them routers. Each one waited for a signal pattern before passing the message along. A century later, people would call it packet switching. But here it arrived in the age of gaslight and steam. By the early 1840s, his diagrams had reached academic circles in London and Paris. The first network nodes were simple. A bank clerk in the city of London could tap out a message asking for grain prices in Calais. His reply would arrive 32 minutes later. That was not magic, but it was close. These machines did not use screens or keyboards. There were no screens at all. Instead, each station had a dial like a compass with letters around its face. Operators entered commands through a series of taps and voltage pulses. The message traveled along copper wires under streets and rivers. Every reply was printed on ticker tape, each strip trimmed with shears and stored in drawers. The room always smelled like wax oil and hot paper. In Paris, a similar machine sat on the desk of a postmaster in the 7th arrondissement. By 1844, the network included 27 active stations across London and Paris. Berlin joined soon after. The wire was not fast. Messages had to be queued, encoded, timed, and routed. At first, the users were not scholars or nobles, but curiosity followed close behind utility. Still, the network kept growing. Every new station needed 2 trained operators. The system remained text only. No images, no voices, no sound. The British Foreign Office commissioned a study on the system's potential military applications. Could troop movements be coordinated across borders? Could codes be shared without couriers? They tested it with naval logistics, routing dispatches from Whitehall to Plymouth, then relaying them to ships using optical semaphore. The results were mixed, describing their system not as a communications device, but as a logic relay. The term drew polite confusion. Logic belonged to philosophy, not to wires. And yet the machines they built obeyed logic more faithfully than any human ever had. The relay, they explained, could not misjudge, but because they lived in timing, they understood the rhythm of pulse and pause, began routing international requests through the wire rather than waiting for physical letters. If a document was missing, a name or a parcel lacked a return address, the operator could ping the originating station and receive clarification within the hour. A week's delay became a lunchtime errand. Letter errors dropped. Package loss declined. People started trusting the system. And trust in these years was more important than speed. They developed their own shorthand, their own syntax, trimming unnecessary signals to make space for urgent ones. A network etiquette evolved, quiet patterns of respect and clarity. But as machinists gained experience, the modules grew smaller, quieter, and more reliable. Brass was replaced with polished steel, then again with an alloy designed to resist rust. Punch cards replaced ticker tape in a few cities, though many operators still preferred the feel of the tape, the warmth of its arrival. In Göttingen, the university installed its first full switchboard system in 1849, staffed entirely by graduate students from the mathematics department. They translated lecture notes, printed scientific queries, and answered distant academic requests, all by hand, all through the network. Their notes were bound and kept in the archives, where some still exist to this day. If someone used the full address stamp, it meant the message was formal. If they omitted it, it was a rush notice. But it did not take long for professors to realize its power. A philosopher in Oxford could correspond with a physicist in Vienna in the same week, exchanging paragraphs and theories without a single postage stamp. Some began compiling these correspondences into printed folios, calling them wire books, early sprawling compilations of intercontinental thought. Students learned to read them the way their parents read newspapers. They contained disputes, jokes, apologies, and drafts. The world of letters became a world of threads. If they repeated the lead pulse 3 times, it meant a crisis. Collision risk, washed bridge, lost cargo, or worse. Operators called this the tap of fear. Most never used it once in their lives. But when it came, the room always fell silent. It could only accept or reject. It remembered no favorites. Yes or no, on or off, forward or stop. Over the next few years, these chambers, these thinking cylinders, spread quietly, not because they were beautiful or easy to install. They were neither, but because they worked. They solved problems. And in the eyes of clerks and workers and tired men who ran the rails, that was all that mattered. The human element still failed at the edges. Messages arrived from Edinburgh, Birmingham, even as far south as Dover. Each one contained routing data for coal shipments, passenger manifests, and locomotive schedules. Before, the wire coordination had required guesswork and lead time. Delays were inevitable. But now the line master could look at the latest arrivals and immediately decide which sidings to clear, which shipments to hold, and which crews to redirect. It did not make the trains faster. It made the decisions clearer. And for the first time, a late train did not mean a late answer. But the implications lingered. There were whispers of a secure military subnet, a classified layer of the wire, operated only by cleared personnel. Whether it existed or not, no one could say. But the rumor alone changed the tone of the network. But information moved. It had become a nervous system. Crude, yes, but alive in its own way. Messages flew between cities, like impulses relayed by unseen hands in basements and towers. And while most people had never touched a switchboard, they knew someone who had. It was spreading, not like a fire, but like roots beneath the pavement, inching outward, finding the cracks, and with it, the people who depended on it. A group of engineers sat in a candlelit room, wondering what might happen if these messages could be stored, not printed, not read, just held, for a moment or forever. A small chamber of gears and levers ticked softly in the background. The room smelled of iron and smoke. They had no word for server, but they were building one anyway. A clerk in Prague could publish a call for technical help and receive a reply from Warsaw before sundown. A librarian in Zurich could request a specific translation from an Oxford fellow and receive it 2 days later. Digitized on ticker tape, of course. Transcripts of public debates from the French Assembly were routed to law students in Edinburgh, who read them by candlelight and annotated the margins. It was slower than thought and faster than print, and for the first time in history it felt like the cities of Europe were listening to each other. Governments took notice. By the close of the decade, it was clear the wire had outgrown its original purpose. It was no longer just a tool for trade. And somewhere in the quiet, in a small town near the border of Belgium, the engineers who worked by candlelight near the Belgian border would go on to publish a small paper, quietly circulated through university libraries. At the main railway yard in York, a receiving station was placed directly above the dispatch office. Railway dispatchers became some of the most skilled network users in Britain. Not because they had technical training. Many had never even attended grammar school. Elsewhere, in the post office halls of Paris and Lyon, another kind of network user emerged. The mail sorters, always precise, always pressed for time. The machines themselves began to evolve. The earliest relay nodes were temperamental, heat-sensitive, soot-prone, and often loud. Education changed slowly. At first, the wire was seen as a curiosity, a distraction from real study. But it did not take long for professors to realize its power. A philosopher in Oxford could correspond with a physicist in Vienna in the same week, exchanging paragraphs and theories without a single postage stamp. Some began compiling these correspondences into printed folios, calling them wire books, early, sprawling compilations of intercontinental thought. Students learned to read them the way their parents read newspapers. They contained disputes, jokes, apologies, and drafts. The world of letters became a world of threads. The messages were not passed by line of sight anymore. Instead, they were collected, condensed, and then broadcast in sequence to regional stations. In Manchester, a cotton mill foreman installed a terminal in his office, using it to order supplies and report output figures. At first, the workers ignored it. Wires degraded. Serialized treatises submitted through the university's wire node, then discussed and critiqued by peers across Europe. A young man named Nathaniel Short published a lengthy argument on natural theology and received 9 rebuttals within the month. It was buried, hidden, a mesh of brass relays and telegraph pulses crawling beneath European soil, and told only that it was for communication. Inside, he found a compact relay box, a bundle of spooled copper wire, and a printed manual describing the proper voltage ranges for each region as humidity. A local technician helped him assemble the terminal in a spare storage room. It took 4 days to calibrate the pressure system that powered the logic coil. But on the 5th, they sent a test message to London. The reply said, "Received and clear, maintain course." It arrived 9 days later. It might as well have been instant. The quartermaster made a note in his ledger and began updating his provisioning schedules with a calm he had not felt since leaving Portsmouth. Now stretched its feelers outward, seeking new applications in lands governed more by distance than consensus. The British Empire, vast and increasingly conscious of its own complexity, was among the first to recognize the system's military potential. It did not matter that the system was not fast by modern standards. It was faster than mailboats, faster than coded dispatches handed from rider to rider. It was just fast enough to feel like foresight, whispered through pipes and coils, tapped out in the quiet hours before dawn. You could not see it, but you could feel its effects in the regularity of your post, the timing of your train, the price of your flour. It was a ghost that moved by signal, and soon it would no longer be content to whisper. Each one printed, folded, and slipped under his door at breakfast. He kept them all, or traced the loops of logic that kept the network alive. They were beginning to feel its weight in the shape of their days. The train arrived with fewer surprises. The merchant received his invoice before his goods. The scholar found his foreign reference already annotated. The baker in the small northern village knew by Thursday what flour would cost on Monday. There was no ceremony to it, no speeches or pronouncements, just a quiet reshaping. And before anyone had time to properly name the change, it had spread far beyond what even its builders had planned. In a quiet corner of the library, others gathered to read the debate. They did not know they were watching the birth of academic forums. They thought they were just avoiding lectures. Relays jammed, dust clogged gears. So a new trade emerged. The lineman technician, half electrician, half mechanic. These men, and later women, traveled from town to town, inspecting coils, cleaning circuits, and replacing worn parts. They wore dark coats with leather pouches filled with tools and schematics. In inns and taverns, they were treated with quiet respect. People knew they carried messages, not just their own, but everyone's. A technician might pass through a village once a month, sit by the hearth, and recite the latest bulletins from the capital. News traveled on their boots as much as through their wires. It was another tool, no different from the clock. But gradually the terminal began affecting their hours, their deliveries, even their pay. A missed shipment meant reduced work. An early dispatch earned bonuses. The wire did not just move messages, it moved expectations. Workers began to ask what the terminal had received that morning. They asked about sales, about orders, about demand. It made them restless, but also curious. In time, some would learn to operate the terminal themselves. Each week, the tower printed a consolidated digest, bound it in canvas, and sent copies to post offices and schools. It was called La Resume National, and for many rural citizens, it was their first exposure to the wider network. It did not matter that they could not afford a terminal. The information reached them anyway, not from kings or parliaments, but from station masters and telegraph overseers. It was an informal expansion, no grand declaration, no empire-wide rollout, just the slow, steady work of people who found it useful. By 1852, the network touched nearly every major capital in Western Europe, and tendrils were reaching into the Balkans, the Caucasus, and beyond. And then there was the tower. In London, the Guildhall established a public reading room where any citizen could request a network query. A clerk would take down the request route, and deliver the printed response the next day. Topics ranged from weather reports and commodity prices to translated excerpts from foreign newspapers. It was not fast, but it was enough. People began to feel softly and quietly that they were part of something larger. A man in Cornwall might request an article from a Belgian journal on mechanical plows. A woman in Aberdeen might ask for the price of lace in Florence, and they would receive it, not instantly, but soon enough to matter. In the hills outside Dijon, remnants of the old semaphore system still stood. France had once maintained one of the largest visual relay networks in the world. A line of towers equipped with rotating arms used to pass messages from one horizon to the next. But with the spread of wires and underground cabling, most towers fell into disuse. A few were converted into lookouts or observation posts. but one, a central junction, once known simply as Station Sync, was reactivated, not as a semaphore, but as a repeater node. The idea came from a retired signals captain who believed the old tower's height and visibility made it ideal for long-distance reception. With some adaptation, mostly involving signal mirrors, pneumatic tubes, and relay boxes, the tower began functioning again, this time as a national hub. Data arrived from Paris, Lyon, Toulouse, and beyond. Similar models appeared elsewhere. Factories also began to take notice. The machines still required maintenance. At Cambridge, students began writing full essays as rooted documents, and while the scholars debated the railways marched on, more terminals appeared in more cities. Each one required permissions, funding, and approval. And yet, despite its reach, the wire remained invisible to most. And though most could not name the cables beneath their cities, what began as a continental curiosity. In Bombay, a young assistant quartermaster, barely into his 20s and still unused to the climate, was handed a crate marked with the royal cipher. Across the continent, in Cape Town, the colonial governor's staff had already begun adapting their clerical system to accommodate the network. Officers wrote briefings in a new condensed format. Line breaks were added for relay timing. Formal salutes were removed to preserve signal space. Administrative clerks, once prized solely for penmanship and memory, now learned how to operate, decode wheels, and maintain contact logs. The rooms themselves, changed to the old timbered offices, were retrofitted with iron tables lined with insulation wool to muffle the humming of the relays. It was not quiet, but it was manageable. One clerk described the noise as a kind of patient breath, always in the background, reminding you that something bigger was waiting for you to act. But in the shaded alcoves of universities, behind the ink-stained fingers of philosophers and pamphleteers, a new kind of thinking had begun to take shape. If information could move so freely, who decided what it was allowed to become? The uses were almost immediately practical. That the reading rooms established across England be given permanent status as institutions of independent correspondence. The name was awkward, but the idea was not. Tradesmen would look for suppliers, but others, quieter, more patient, came just to read. They came to study the thoughts of strangers, to watch how others asked, how others explained, and some of them eventually found their voice. And perhaps more importantly, they made it belong to the people who needed it, heatedly. A series of open letters between faculty at Göttingen and Edinburgh questioned whether the spread of immediate access would degrade intellectual rigor. One professor argued that without the labor of searching, knowledge became a glimmer rather than a flame. Another replied more simply that access did not kill depth, impatience did. The debate raged on, but in the meantime, more students posted, more theses, more readers replied, and somewhere, beneath the feet of those arguing, the wire simply kept moving. These were rooms with terminals, one per village, if resources allowed. Terms like netizens, once a strange blend of Latin roots and technological novelty, began appearing in journals and speeches. Newspapers adopted the word slowly, then all at once. Netizens were not revolutionaries. They were not radicals. They were people who participated, who listened, who asked and responded and occasionally corrected. It was not where citizens, regardless of class or title, could send and receive questions. No cost, no filtering, just access. Troop rotations, supply shortages, water rationing orders. And so, one by one, more terminals were installed. some in churches, some in post offices, some in the back rooms of alehouses, where the ink smudged and the paper yellowed. But the questions still arrived on time. Local authorities had requisitioned an operator-S table from the Royal Post, repurposed it, a single table, a terminal, a chair, a wall-mounted board where answers and discussions could be pinned for others to see. But they became busy, they became trusted, and in time they became necessary. As a town node and hired 3 students from the university to manage it. They were young, underpaid, and wildly enthusiastic. Each day they processed requests from provincial offices and merchant guilds. But once patterns emerged, regular contributors, small arguments, shared interests, the boards became communities, not loud, not fast, but steady. A Coleman from Sheffield wrote weekly on working conditions. A former midwife from Kent posted herbal remedies and debated anatomy with a printer from Leicester. A clerk in Bristol developed a reputation for puns and hand-drawn diagrams explaining tax law. His posts were copied and pinned to boards in 5 counties. He never left Bristol. They compiled crop yields, requested shipping schedules, and occasionally entertained curious letters from school children asking what weather was like in Edinburgh. It became common to find someone standing outside the relay house long before opening, just waiting to submit a query. All transmitted with a clarity that could no longer be misinterpreted or delayed. Officers in remote garrisons began reporting their own inventories. Decisions that once required a month's ride could now be made within the fortnight. Even field hospitals previously dependent on guesswork and delay began requesting shipments directly. The logic system was not built for care, but it delivered assistance nonetheless. In Sydney, a similar transformation was underway. But while the empire organized itself across vast oceans and unfamiliar terrain, something quieter but no less significant was forming back home. The network had always served those in authority first. It was by design a system that rewarded control. At Oxford, a senior fellow in ancient languages submitted a modest proposal to the University Council. The proposal was approved not with applause, but with weary nods. The wire had already proven itself economically. A little generosity would not undo that. The reading rooms were humble. Mothers would query birth registries or distant cousins. Workers would arrive on Sundays, boots still damp from the fields, and ask about rail fares in nearby towns. The earliest message boards were simple. These were not universities. They were not printing presses, but they served the same purpose. They made knowledge visible. Of course, the academic world did not ignore this shift. It debated it. Even the language began to change, and that behavior changed cities. In Manchester, the city council installed a relay hub in a disused grain silo. Within 6 months, it became the center of a growing archive, not just of official records, but of citizen correspondence. Requests for sidewalk repairs, notes about noisy factories, lists of apprentices seeking work. It was not law, but it felt like attention, and in a time when many felt invisible that mattered. In Dublin, a pub owner installed a terminal in his back room open to anyone who bought a pint. He posted notices from the wire alongside the day's menu. A monthly paper printed by a retired typesetter and his niece, who collected the most discussed forum threads and transcribed them by hand. They gave it a modest name, Relay Digest. What began as a handful of pages tucked into envelopes for friends grew into a weekly run of several hundred copies, each one summarizing the month's best debates, cleverest jokes, and quietest reflections. It did not carry headlines. It carried thoughts. Readers who had only known Dickens through serialized novels now encountered his thoughts in real time, unvarnished, direct, printed locally, often weekly. These publications curated the best of the boards. They varied in tone and scope. Some focused on humor, collecting witty rejoinders and satirical sketches. Others specialized in political commentary, translating arguments across borders and offering gentle summaries for those just joining the conversation. Still others served educational roles, compiling lectures posted by university staff and distributing them to schools without formal libraries. Some even included artwork, printed renditions of sketches shared in the forums, hand-drawn maps of debated territories, or woodcut illustrations accompanying serialized folk tales. And he was not alone. Other writers followed, some well-known, others anonymous, drawn not by profit but by proximity. The wire brought them closer to their readers, and in doing so, it made writing feel less like performance and more like conversation, stitched together gently, without drama or spectacle. Prices of wheat. In Bristol, the People's Wire began publishing regular commentary gathered from message boards across England and Ireland. The larger houses feared erosion, not of audience, but of authority. When ideas could circulate without their blessing, the weight of editorial control began to seem less like guidance and more like a bottleneck. Some responded by doubling down, publishing essays condemning the network as intellectually unstable, warning that, without proper oversight, society risked drowning in opinion. Others attempted to co-opt the system, hiring copyists to post promotional excerpts and reviews on message boards, hoping to steer conversation back toward their titles. But the public noticed, and they did not take kindly to being managed. In Lion Lavoix compiled philosophical dialogues between readers in Marseille and Paris. In Vienna, Die Netzblätter offered translations of political essays from across the empire, written not by politicians, but by factory clerks, schoolboys, and retired civil servants. A cultural mirror had begun to form, one no longer held only by those with printing presses, but by those with questions, not equal, not universal, but it was growing. He had once visited one near Paddington during a train delay, and spent an hour reading posts about chimney, sweeping tenant rights, and the moral education of orphans. He later described the experience as a walk through the minds of 1,000 quiet Englishmen. In 1856, under no pseudonym and with no publisher, he began contributing short pieces directly to the network. Observations, really, gentle essays, reflections on life in the city, portraits of everyday kindness and cruelty. He called them penny thoughts, though they were never sold. They traveled from reading room to reading room, recopied, retyped, discussed, and archived. Some even reached India, carried in packets alongside military dispatches, and tucked into relay cabinets by curious clerks. And wherever it reached, it invited something few had expected. Notes from returning emigrants, political essays from Paris. On Friday evenings, a local teacher read the week's most discussed posts aloud over a single candle. Patrons raised glasses, not in agreement, but in recognition that someone else had written, that someone else had thought, and still in far places, in Adelaide, in Accra, in Rangoon, the empire ticked along, its officers adjusting rosters, mapping movements, updating codes. Those who had long defined the public conversation by ink alone were the last to understand how deeply the ground had already shifted beneath them. The publishing houses of London and Paris, still confident in their presses and their contracts, watched the rise of the reading rooms with more curiosity than concern. To them, this new network of terminals and message boards seemed like a novelty tucked into corners of public life, more useful for weather forecasts and factory schedules than for anything of cultural weight. Serious writing, they believed, belonged on paper. It required curation, editing, and above all, permission. The terminals hummed. Editors clung to the belief that the printed page would always carry the most authority. But as more towns posted their own message boards and more terminals were installed in neighborhood libraries, and the content changed, essays became more refined. Arguments became structured. The language once loose and conversational grew sharper, not in tone, but in clarity. It became clear that these were not simply passing thoughts. They were publications in their own right, written by tradesmen, scholars, and school teachers, who had never seen their names in print, but who had found through the relay a new form of reach. The wires breathed, and messages passed like ghostly handwriting through 100 unseen hands. The system was not perfect. Participation, and even as the quiet rhythm of participation began to ripple outward, at first they ignored the forums entirely. It was not until someone started printing them that the press began to take notice. In Edinburgh, a small newsletter had long circulated among the reading rooms. Within a year, more papers followed. Naturally, the publishers were not pleased. Still, not all within the literary world were resistant. Charles Dickens, already a beloved figure, had grown fascinated by the reading rooms. This informal circulation did not lessen his popularity, it deepened it. By the 1860s, net papers had become a recognized category. But perhaps the most important change came not from the words, but from the audience. Workers, once isolated by geography and labor, began seeing their struggles mirrored in posts from abroad. A machinist in Birmingham would read about iron tariffs in Belgium and realize he was not alone. Though not an early adopter, he recognized the potential of what he called the mechanical agora, made it nearly impossible to police. The savvier publishers began incorporating network content into their own papers. Schoolmasters began encouraging students to submit short essays or questions to local boards. Some schools hosted their own terminals, where older pupils assisted younger ones in composing messages. A 10-year-old girl from Norwich famously posted a question asking why the moon followed her on her walk home. Dozens of responses arrived, ranging from poetic to scientific, and were later compiled into a small booklet titled The Moon and Miss Eleanor. It sold out its first printing in a month, adding from the wire sections to showcase reader correspondence or republish particularly compelling forum threads. Some hired former board moderators as columnists, printing quietly beneath gas bombs, threading words through fingers that had never held a pen, but now carried thoughts into places they never imagined. Men who once relied solely on ledgers, runners, and shouted commands across smoky floors. Relay hubs, once used for administrative queries, were repurposed to handle bulk industrial correspondence. Regional boards in cities like Birmingham and Lyons became clearinghouses for production schedules, material exchanges, and shared inventories. A mill in Rouen could see which patterns had been popular in Scotland the month before. A glass works in Bohemia might inquire quietly and without fanfare about the temperature protocols used in Dutch kilns. It was not cooperation in the formal sense, not formally. But their intent was clear. Typed summaries of grievances, comparisons of pay scales, calls for solidarity wrapped in the language of concern. Some used coded phrases, others were direct. In Birmingham, one post read simply, "The forge is not the only place that can temper steel." It was copied 12 times in 3 days, then quietly included in a net digest, circulated to over 1,000 readers. But it was connection, and with connection came change. Now found themselves staring at thin-wheeled cabinets fitted with rotary switches and spooled paper. Each morning messages arrived with updates, new shipments incoming. Companies that once operated in silence found themselves slowly tuning to each other's tempo. Dye houses began coordinating shipments with spinning mills. Tanners adjusted delivery based on reports from bootmakers. Across borders and across language, the machine pulled the work closer together, not tightly, but close enough to feel. Thread counts changed, clients requesting modifications. These notices did not feel like orders. They felt like conversation, calm, direct, structured, and the men who received them, many barely literate, trained more in routine than reading, quickly learned to decipher their cadence. It was not long before operators were hired not to manage the machines, but to interpret their manners. Others partnered with reading rooms to offer subscription bundles, to hand the weight of the wire pressed deeper into the bones of the age. It no longer felt like a marvel, not quite. Cobbled together from salvaged parts and mounted on a crate of bolts, but it worked. They used it not for management orders, but to post questions about ventilation, about furnace repair, about injury compensation, and the responses came, slowly, imperfectly, but they came. A fitter in Essen described a safer way to remove slag. A smith in Milan shared advice about bracing iron beams. Over time, the messages turned from technical to social. Discussions of wages, of hours, of union dues whispered their way across the pages. It had begun to resemble something more permanent, not just an addition to life, but part of its rhythm. And when life changes slowly enough, even the extraordinary becomes ordinary. Who feared that too much speaking would drown the voices that mattered most. But in workshop and study, in kitchen and classroom, the murmur grew, not loud, not sudden, just steady. And somewhere in the middle of it, someone posted a simple thought. For a penny more, a reader could receive both the daily paper and the week SNet digest. The line between traditional and new media began to blur. And while some lamented the decline of old editorial standards, others saw in this merging something more democratic, an invitation to think aloud. But in places of labor, in the textile towns of Lancashire and Saxony, manufacturers began to experiment with linking orders between mills. At first, the results were modest. A request for a bolt of fabric in Leeds would appear a day later in a dye house in Ghent. A weaver in Mulhouse would receive measurements from a tailor in York. These were not real-time exchanges. Nothing about the system was fast. But the delays were no longer weeks. They were days, sometimes hours. And that small compression of time proved transformative. To join the murmur rather than wait for the sermon. A banned message in London might still be read in York. A redacted essay in Dublin would resurface days later in Galway, rephrased but intact. Authorities could pressure specific terminals, but they could not silence the system. It had no central voice, only echoes. A place where workers might speak to each other without mediation. He did not post himself often, preferring to observe. But his ideas moved quickly. Short summaries of Das Kapital circulated across forums, simplified and discussed in language accessible to those with little formal education. One reader referred to it as a theory that finally feels like it belongs to us. By 1871, early labor organizers were using the network to coordinate schedules, print flyers, and refine talking points for meetings. The wire was not a revolution, but it was an accelerant. A textile worker in Lyon would find solidarity in the words of a spinner from Manchester. The conversations were quiet, careful, sometimes halting in translation, but they were real, and they carried weight. Karl Marx, living in London and already publishing pamphlets in more traditional channels, took note of this new network with great interest. Censorship efforts, where they appeared, were largely ineffective. The physical nature of the network, its handwritten notes, its decentralized boards, the press reluctantly adapted. Even children took part. And yet, through all this change, the wire remained modest. It did not trumpet its victories. It merely persisted, humming softly through relay cabinets. There were still those who distrusted it. 1,000 presses could never match the warmth of one honest voice. And as the words continued to drift from relay to paper, and from paper, by the early 1870s, the quiet machines that once sat idle in university basements and civic reading rooms were finding new homes, not in places of thought alone. It began, as most things did in that era, with logistics, factory foremen. At the same time, the networks between factories grew more intentional. Patterns began to emerge. In Manchester, a group of ironworkers installed a terminal in the break room of their foundry. It was a makeshift thing. By 1875, the first organized labor bulletins began appearing across the network. They were not labeled as such. The factory owners noticed, not at once, but in time. Some responded by restricting access to the terminals. Others removed them entirely. A few attempted to flood the boards with distractions, posts about irrelevant topics, faux advice columns, even company-sponsored praise under pseudonyms. But the workers knew. They recognized the tone. In Lille, a pair of seamstresses paid a retired wirekeeper to install a line through the attic of their boarding house. In Warsaw, a group of printers built a crude decoder from clock parts and mirror glass, allowing them to read encrypted bulletins without detection. These were not acts of rebellion for their own sake. They were acts of survival, not just of the body, but of the dignity that comes from being heard. A few factory owners, more curious than cruel, allowed terminals to remain, even contributing to discussions anonymously. These moments were rare, but they mattered. In an era defined by hierarchy, even a little horizontal trust felt revolutionary. They responded not with outrage, but with a deeper kind of resistance. They built their own boards. The fire began in the relay cabinet and spread quickly through the wooden rafters. A note left nearby read, "We destroyed the loom. We will destroy this too." Editorials warned of unchecked communication past heavy doors and stone walls. In Manchester, a workers' group began rotating their board location each week, notifying members through chalk symbols on lampposts. It was not just about protection. It was about stewardship. They were not defending machines. They were defending conversation, of thoughts traveling too freely. A few MPs called for registration laws, requiring terminal operators to log all messages and report suspicious phrases. But enforcement proved impossible. The network was too vast, too varied, too human. And besides, the public had grown fond of their quiet rooms, their daily threads, their gentle murmurs of connection. The attacks did not inspire fear, they inspired care. A week later, a terminal in Derby was smashed with a sledgehammer. Another in Antwerp was torn apart with crowbars. The spools unfurled and set ablaze in the square. In the outskirts of Glasgow, a group of machinists constructed a hidden relay in the back room of a bakery. The techniques of the time were far too basic for that. But through shared conventions, workers developed simple substitution codes. Phrases like wool shortage came to mean underpaid hours. Thread breakage stood in for manager interference. A post about foreign dye inconsistencies might detail a policy change affecting migrant labor. It was a shared language, born of necessity, passed hand to hand like a prayer. Encryption, too, became more common, not in the mathematical sense, and not everyone saw it as a threat. Some foremen quietly encouraged the boards, recognizing that informed workers often worked more safely, and that communication sometimes prevented strikes before they began. Descendants in spirit, if not in blood, of those who once smashed looms, turned their attention from threads of cloth to threads of thought. They saw in the network not empowerment but intrusion, a new kind of machine, more insidious than any spindle or shuttle. And unlike the factories, these terminals had no guards. They were often placed in open rooms, unmonitored, unchained, easy to reach, easier to ruin. Still, not all reactions were so gentle. In Nottingham, a group of Luddites, in the winter of 1876, a reading room in Halifax was burned to the ground. The attacks did not go unnoticed. In London, newspapers debated whether the network had grown too bold. Reading rooms began adding shutters. Some hired attendants. Others moved terminals deeper inside buildings. Technicians began experimenting with fireproof casings. Relay cabinets were lined with clay tile or mounted in iron boxes. Some terminals were made mobile so they could be wheeled into shops during the day and hidden away at night. The community around them grew stronger. Children were taught how to replace fuses. Elders copied important threads by hand and stored them carefully in ledgers. The machine had never been just wires. It was memory, shared and stubborn and warm. Meanwhile, industry continued its dance. Shipping manifests that were once carried in duplicate by rail or boat now traveled along the wire. A shipment of steel rails leaving Sheffield could notify the docks in Marseille before the train even reached Dover. A grocer in Rotterdam might update a wholesaler in Vienna about supply shortages without ever lifting a pen. The quiet cadence of commerce, always humming beneath the clamor of politics and invention, found its own voice in the system. It was not loud, but it was unmistakably there. And in this murmur, something rare began to form. It was a culture not of silence, but of stillness, a space where thoughts were not shouted, but shared, where time moved not as an enemy, but as a companion. And in the dim corners of foundries and the bright halls of civic buildings, in attics, in bakeries, in coal sheds, and classrooms, the wire whispered on, not as a command, not as a broadcast, but as a question. What if you could hear the world listening back? Yet even in the hush of careful rooms, and even in the warmth of shared memory, it was never just the workers who listened. Alongside them and behind them and sometimes ahead of them were others who watched with equal patience, but for a different purpose. For wherever information gathers quietly and steadily, power does not sit still for long. In the palaces of Petersburg, the Tsar's ministers had been slow to grasp the scale of it all. At first, they assumed the machines to be like so many others before them, devices of convenience, tools to improve the lives of telegraph clerks and station managers. But then came the student letters. Bits of philosophy traveled from Göttingen to Kiev in less than a week. Copies of lecture notes filled with strange ideas about society and class made their way into provincial schools. In the Urals, a mention faint but troubling of reform. And it was then that the concern began to settle. By the year 1878, the Imperial Office of Communication issued its first decree. No external university feeds were to be displayed in public reading rooms without approval. Terminals already connected to Paris or Berlin were to be severed and rerouted through Petrograd. Quietly new inspectors were appointed. Men who would sit in the corner of message halls with folded hands and two steady eyes, pretending to read newspapers while noting which lines blinked and when. Soon it became clear that certain phrases no longer arrived. A question sent from Krakow to Heidelberg might simply vanish. A bulletin forwarded from Zurich would appear, but with entire sections blurred or missing. They called it among themselves the blank cough, as if the machine had choked softly and moved on. Elsewhere, regulation took a different shape. In Vienna, the Austro-Hungarian Parliament passed the Network Ordinance of 1879. This law established the Bureau for Terminal Content Review. At first, the bureau was small, 5 clerks, 3 switches, 1 typewriter. But the mandate was wide. They were tasked with monitoring all public terminals within the empire for seditious or destabilizing information. They worked not with firewalls, but with ink. Messages flagged for concern were copied by hand and reviewed line by line, then archived in green-bound ledgers that by the year's end filled an entire wing of the Hofburg. But censorship is not a tool of silence alone. It also creates sound, strange echoes and shadows where words should be. And those silences speak just as loudly. Students began noticing patterns in what was missing. A lecture on thermodynamics would arrive, but its closing paragraph, a simple discussion on entropy, might be gone. A philosopher's post on individual conscience might be delivered, but the footnote about governance would be mysteriously blank. Over time, a secondary network began to bloom, not from what was written, but from what was not. They called it the margin. Ideas passed not as messages, but as omissions, carried on the shape of absence itself. In Britain, the response was less about erasure and more about observation. The Home Office, always a quiet collector of tools, began installing duplicate terminals in key locations, not to intercept messages, but to copy them. These mirrored nodes, as they were called internally, were often hidden inside customs offices, post depots, or rail inspection sheds. The data was not processed live, since the technology did not yet allow for that, but it was stored by hand and by wheel and by ink. Paper reels stacked in brass drawers, each thread a slow pulse of the nation's thoughts. Ireland, already a subject of scrutiny, became a testbed. In Dublin, reading rooms were quietly outfitted with modified terminals. Unknown to most, each post sent from the Irish network was duplicated and redirected to an office beneath the General Post Office. There, a team of 10 analysts, many of them former clerks, read each message aloud before logging it into ledger books. The work was tedious, Much of it was mundane. Orders for pig iron, announcements for lost boots, arguments over coal prices. But scattered among them were sharper things. Complaints about land rents, references to independence meetings, questions about Fenian publications. These were noted, highlighted, and passed along. But even as the watchful eyes multiplied, they were never quite fast enough. In Boston, a printer named Elijah Braddock began transmitting coded messages to abolitionist groups across the country. At first, his bulletin board was simple: notices of lectures, religious texts, advice on navigation. But soon his posts grew more intricate. Using a cipher based on rail schedules and hymn numbers, he embedded routes and meeting locations in plain sight. A hymn marked 34 might indicate a safe house in Charleston. A verse from Isaiah could describe a departure point near the Ohio border. Braddock was not alone. Throughout the northern United States, abolitionist networks began using the system to quietly coordinate. Phrases like linen shipment delayed might mean a family was moving. Hardware order received could indicate a successful border crossing. The boards became more than terminals. They were threads of safety, stretched thin but unbroken. And yet for every act of protection there were countermeasures. Southern officials, aware of the growing use of the network, began to demand message records from public terminals. Operators were threatened with fines if they failed to comply. A few were jailed. Some complied. Others claimed ignorance, erasing logs as fast as they came in. In Louisiana, a small town librarian who refused to turn over her terminal was accused of mechanical subversion. Her reading room was closed. Her terminal was confiscated. Still, the network persisted. In Richmond, a newspaper editor noted that his wire had been slow for a week. Messages arrived out of order. Some never arrived at all. He blamed weather, but others suspected interference. Around the same time, a message appeared on a board in Cincinnati. It read, "The wire bends. It does not break." Across the Atlantic, similar tensions were emerging. In the Ottoman Empire, discussions began about whether foreign nodes should be allowed within Constantinople. Some ministers argued for openness. They said the network would modernize trade, improve record-keeping, and strengthen the empire's position. Others feared infiltration, subversion, and chaos. In the end, a compromise was reached. Foreign terminals were allowed, but only within embassies. Messages in Turkish were to be mirrored automatically. The lines, it was said, could remain open, but not invisible. As governments wrestled for control, the machines adapted again. Some terminals were modified to operate independently using local message caches that stored content offline until it could be manually delivered. These buffer boxes, as they came to be called, allowed groups to maintain access even when monitored lines were cut. They were bulky and clunky and prone to heat, but they worked. These messages, when intercepted, made little sense. But for those in the know, they created a living map of action stitched across towns and counties by women who could not always march, but could always type. And behind it all, in the dusty study of a house in Marylebone, Ada Lovelace wrote, not constantly, not in full health, but often enough to leave a trail. While her early work on algorithms and calculation machines was well known, her later experiments with the network were lesser known. Often they were passed around in private circles or published under initials, but her thoughts were precise. She saw not only what the network was, but what it could become. She proposed a system not yet practical, but conceptually sound for filtering information automatically. It was not filtering in the modern sense. There were no scripts or programs, but her method involved arranging message tags in sequences that could be accepted or rejected based on preference. In essence, it was an early form of content sorting. She called it preference matrices, and though few understood it fully at the time, it would quietly shape everything that came later. At the same time, something else was stirring. Not in the open halls of universities or the smoky rooms of parliament, but in the quiet corners of the network, where names blurred and voices softened. Women writing not as themselves, but as shadows, posting arguments, essays, questions, sometimes under male pseudonyms, sometimes under no name at all. One such voice, known only as N, began appearing in 1882, first in Berlin, then in Vienna, and later in Geneva. The posts of N were thoughtful, sharp, patient. They asked difficult questions. Why were certain readings forbidden? Why were the writings of women relegated to leisure, while the writings of men were assumed to be serious? N never shouted, never accused, just asked, gently, week after week. Soon others followed. In Amsterdam, a writer calling herself Salt began posting serialized essays on domestic labor. She reframed the work of cleaning, caregiving, and cooking as forms of economic contribution. In Milan, Beatrice are composed fictional dialogues between women and their daughters. Each was centered around a different virtue. Not obedience, but courage, skepticism, curiosity. And in Edinburgh, a woman writing under the name Miss Holloway began answering questions from readers about reading itself. What books to start with? How to know when an argument was sound? What to do when a text made you feel small? These were not grand revolutions, not marches or manifestos, but they changed the shape of the network. Where once the majority of traffic had been business, trade, and technical exchange, now there was something else: reflection, connection, question, and more than that, community. Women who had never left their villages now exchanged words with others hundreds of miles away. A widow in Norfolk might share a recipe with a seamstress in Cardiff. A young reader in Warsaw might find the words of N copied and posted in a local schoolhouse. Over time, the network began to bend, not in power. Governments still watched, rules still governed, but in culture, the style of messages changed. Abrupt postings became less common. Long-form essays and reflective commentary became the norm. Even trade announcements began to include small stories or greetings. It was as if the network itself had grown more human, shaped not by authority, but by care. And beneath all of it, the women continued to write. They did not seek credit. Their names were often unknown, but their presence could be felt in the phrasing of questions, in the calm of responses, in the slow but steady rise of conversation as something more than exchange, as something sacred. And somewhere beyond the quiet rooms where women still posted under initials, beyond the gaslit reading halls and filtered relay desks of London and Lyon, the network kept growing, not outward in the loud way, not in fanfare or ceremony, but downward like roots. It reached into places it had not reached before. Not with wires at first, but with paper, with print, with the patient rhythm of weekly packets. It started in the north, in a windswept village on the coast of Caithness, where the fields broke off into cliffs, and the sky leaned in gray and unblinking. There lived a schoolmaster named Hugh McAlpin. He was not particularly wealthy or connected, but he did have a friend in Inverness who worked for the regional rail office, and that friend once a week would send him a parcel. Inside was a thick stack of printed paper. Not a newspaper. Not exactly. These were terminal summaries, curated feeds from the regional node typeset in small batches and bound with string. They contained notices, essays, debates, diagrams, sometimes even poems. At first, Hugh read them alone. Then he read them aloud to his pupils, then to the village. By the end of the year, the Caithness schoolhouse hosted a Saturday reading circle. Farmers came, weavers, fishmongers. They did not come for politics. Not exactly. They came for ideas. For the novelty of seeing a question from Kent discussed alongside a response from Prague. For the comfort of knowing that someone somewhere had asked the same thing they had been wondering. What is a fair day's wage? Why is grain taxed this way? What makes steam efficient? Where does silk come from? Soon other villages began requesting similar packets. The regional terminals, at first unbothered, began to feel the weight. They adjusted. Each week, a team of moderators compiled digests meant for the rural zones. The packets grew. In Orkney, the packets came by ferry. In Skye, by mounted courier. In Sutherland, they arrived once every 10 days, wrapped in oiled canvas. What started as a courtesy became a system. By 1885, the Scottish lowlands had more printed packet subscribers than the city of Edinburgh. The network, once reserved for terminals and code, had become ink. And it was not just Scotland. In the western Ghats of India, near the tea growing hills, a relay depot at Kodaikanal began printing weekly digests in Marathi and Tamil. The depot had been established by colonial administrators for telegraph maintenance, but the clerk in charge, a man named Ro Vishnudas, began including local submissions. Farmers wrote in to request pricing data. Teachers asked for maps and diagrams. Temple committees asked for the dates of festivals in other provinces. Over time, the packets grew more ambitious. Some included translated essays from British and Bengali scholars. Others carried charts, commentaries, even serialized stories. And while the British administrators had originally encouraged the outreach, calling it civilizational uplift, in their official memos they grew quieter when the questions changed. Why are salt taxes rising? Why are railway contracts held by London firms? Why are local dialects not being archived? In some villages, the answers were debated aloud. In others, they were copied and reposted, hand-scribed to chalkboards, temple walls, even carved into wooden slats for itinerant readers. A question posted in Lucknow might be answered 2 weeks later by a weaver in Madurai. Slowly and almost imperceptibly, the illusion of distance cracked, and across the ocean, in the wide wind-brushed plains of the Dakota Territory, another version of the network unfolded. It began with the rail stops, small boxy depots standing against the open sky like lone punctuation marks. Each had a telegraph station. Most had a clerk, and some of those clerks were connected to the new municipal terminals. Every Wednesday, a packet arrived by train. It included cattle prices, train schedules, essays on irrigation, and increasingly letters. Real ones, reprinted by request from the wire. A settler in Fargo might find a message from his cousin in Philadelphia, copied into the packet waiting at the depot like a letter already opened. Some towns took it further. In one Nebraska settlement, the blacksmith volunteered his workshop for public readings. In another, the schoolteacher began writing exmeners. These were short summaries of more technical entries reworded for farmers. The explainers were sent back into the network, filed under rural logic and eventually became their own category. Feedback flowed both ways, and with this flow came pressure. Peasants and workers, once separated by distance and language, began to read from the same pool of information. In Galicia, a serf's son read about the structure of land leases in Wales. In Finland, a fisherman read a French essay on navigation. In Missouri, a farmer's wife read an Irish post on tenancy laws. And though each came from different worlds, the effect was the same. Realization that certain rules were not natural, that certain prices were not fair, that certain decisions were made by people, and that those people had names. In Silesia, a network of miners began posting anonymously about safety conditions. In Rajasthan, smallholders organized a packet relay that included pricing records from textile merchants in Bombay. In West Virginia, a group of coal workers began circulating early union proposals, not just for their own mine, but for mines in other counties, using only code names and shared phrases. Night coal, they wrote, meant overwork. 3 hands down meant injury. Smoke closed meant a strike was underway. Governments noticed. In Prussia, a decree was issued forbidding the unauthorized reproduction of packet materials. In Bengal, packet printing was restricted to licensed outposts. In the American South, certain types of content, especially those dealing with slavery, taxation, or Northern labor policy, were flagged for suppression. But the packets kept moving, because the packets were not only data, they were symbols, they were invitations. And even when censored, they moved by other means. Handwritten, memorized, passed by whisper. The structure of knowledge was shifting, not from books to terminals, but from distance to closeness. And it was not only the educated who benefited. In parts of Hungary, retired soldiers began teaching packet literacy in taverns. In Java, retired clerks opened packet stations inside food stalls. In Newfoundland, a fisherman's daughter compiled a weather digest based on the network's maritime reports and posted it every Monday beside the village dock. Her reports were often more accurate than the Navis, and in language the change came slow but certain. Most packets were printed in the dominant tongues of the region. English, French, German, but user submissions pushed back. People posted in Welsh, in Kannada, in Innu. Some included translations, others did not. Over time, the network began absorbing more dialects. At some terminals, volunteer interpreters read the messages aloud. At others, bilingual readers posted side-by-side summaries. By 1890, a terminal in Alexandria was logging daily messages in Arabic, Greek, Armenian, and French. No one coordinated it. It simply happened. And, as language barriers softened, so did the lines between propaganda and truth. Where once a regional governor might declare a policy and expect it to echo without challenge, now there were messages, dozens, sometimes hundreds, posted in reply. Some agreed. Many did not. When a flood relief report was published in the New York Packet, readers from St. Louis corrected it. When a military notice was posted in Delhi, a local clerk quietly attached an eyewitness account with different numbers. Not always loudly, but clearly. And though officials tried to control the flow, they found themselves chasing shadows. The packets moved too fast. The responses came too quietly. And in all of this, the questions, the readings, the shared diagrams, the unfolding debates, the shape of society bent again, not toward chaos, but toward understanding. A boy in Cork could name the railway lines in Bavaria. A baker in Warsaw could recite a Mississippi crop forecast. A retired clerk in Kyoto could follow an argument about constitutional reform in Naples. Not all agreed, not all cared, but they could know if they wished. And perhaps in the quiet of those Saturday reading sessions, or the low hum of packet presses turning in the depot basements, or the echo of boots outside a relay station at dusk, the world began to feel, if not smaller than, at least more connected, more awake, more alive. And so the packets kept arriving, across mountains, across oceans, across silence itself, stitching distant voices into familiar echoes. But as the reach of the network deepened, so too did its vulnerability, because for all its warmth and wonder, the network had never been neutral. It was always shaped by those who built it, and now others had learned to bend it too. It began not with malice, but with fear. In the spring of 1870, tension between France and Prussia sharpened like the edge of a whetstone. Diplomats wrote carefully, generals watched their wires, and in the towns along the Rhine, people turned to the network for news. Terminals blinked with rumors. Some said war had already begun. Others said the Prussians were mobilizing in secret. In Paris, packets carried declarations of confidence, then caution, then silence. Then one morning in July, 3 telegraph relays along the Moselle failed at once. Not from storm, not from accident. The wires had been cut, cleanly, deliberately. French operators scrambled to reroute traffic, but the damage spread. One by one, relay stations went dark, and in the absence of signal, uncertainty bloomed. Some towns believed the army was retreating. Others thought Paris had fallen. Misinformation moved faster than correction. In Metz, a false report claimed Prussian troops had already taken the city. In Nancy, the network went silent for 2 days, prompting a rush on food supplies. In Strasbourg, someone posted a list of fabricated casualties. No one knew where it had come from. Across the border, Prussian commanders denied responsibility, but quiet murmurs said otherwise. That a unit trained in wirework had crossed at night, that they had not brought rifles, only cutters, pliers, and coil, that they knew exactly where the lines ran and where the backups were hidden. The first war of signal had begun, not with cannon fire, but with silence. Elsewhere, others took note. The British Admiralty commissioned a review of all undersea cables. The East India Company expanded its signal corps. In Vienna, a committee was formed to study the integrity of informational lines. But no one moved faster than the East India Company, long practiced in the art of indirect control. The company had already used the network to relay trade records and legal proclamations across the subcontinent. But now they feared something else: resistance. Organized, informed, unpredictable. So they built what they called fog stations. Small, outwardly unremarkable buildings positioned near major relay hubs. Inside, copper coils hummed. Operators worked in rotating shifts. Their task was to monitor frequencies and emit randomized magnetic pulses, not enough to break the network, but enough to blur it, to make messages arrive out of order, to garble code just slightly, to disorient, not destroy. It worked. Packet reports from Madras began arriving with misprinted times. Submissions from Calcutta sometimes vanished for days, only to reappear scrambled or misfiled. The problem at first was blamed on heat, on power fluctuations, on Himalayan interference. But as the distortions spread, suspicion grew, and in the back pages of the Bombay Packets essays began appearing under strange signatures. KR Signal Dust, Fogwatch. They accused the company of sabotage. They offered diagrams, instructions, proof. The company denied everything and quietly expanded the fog stations. In Europe, meanwhile, the Commune had risen. The year was 1871. Paris, battered by war, stood in revolution. And though the barricades were built with stone and wood, the battle spread through signal. From terminals in the Montmartre district, communards posted manifestos to the broader network. Some were idealistic, others were sharp. They called for workers' control, for decentralization, for abolition of old hierarchies. And for a brief moment, their words flowed freely from cafe basements, from reading rooms, from repurposed postal halls. Then came the floods. Misinformation poured into the Paris terminals. Some claimed the Commune had declared war on Switzerland. Others reported food riots that had not happened. One message said the Notre Dame had burned to the ground. Another claimed foreign troops were already inside the city. None were true. All were believed somewhere. The source of the messages was never found. Some blamed reactionary loyalists. Others suspected foreign agents. A few whispered of British involvement. But the effect was clear. Confusion, panic, distrust. And with that confusion came response. The Commune began screening posts. Messages were delayed. Forums went quiet. And eventually, when the government retook the city, the terminals were seized. Some were dismantled. Others were repurposed to serve the people, but to observe them. Surveillance had arrived. Elsewhere, similar patterns emerged. In Shanghai, British authorities installed filters that blocked certain queries. In Berlin, the state police began mapping terminal usage patterns. In New York, a consortium of private firms pooled data from reading halls to track public sentiment on tariffs. And in all of this, the idea of the network, once bright with promise, dimmed just slightly. It had not stopped growing, but it no longer felt innocent. And yet resistance continued. In the foothills of the Alps, a group of railway workers used signal mirrors and improvised relays to create their own packet loop outside the official lines. In Senegal, scribes hand-copied forum entries and distributed them on horseback to towns that had been cut off. In Warsaw, a group of students devised a rudimentary encryption system using botanical codes and time offsets, allowing them to communicate without interception. These acts were small, fragile, but persistent, and slowly a new kind of war took shape, not one of territory, but of clarity. To control the signal was no longer just to know. It was to shape what others believed. To delay was to distort. To filter was to rule. And people noticed. Some began demanding transparency. Others demanded protection. Still others demanded something else, entirely disconnection. For the first time, pamphlets began appearing that questioned the very idea of the network, not out of Luddite distrust, but weary skepticism. Had the wires grown too fast? Were the terminals now tools of control rather than empowerment? Was the promise of connection worth the cost of distortion? In certain towns, relay stations were painted over, not destroyed, just silenced, a symbolic gesture. In one Welsh village, workers held a silent vigil outside the packet printer, refusing to enter for a full week. In Dublin, a group of mothers formed a reading circle that refused any content not sourced from local submissions. In Madrid, a writer posted an essay titled "Against the Noise," in which she argued that connection without trust was simply another kind of darkness. Governments, for their part, began proposing reforms, but most were half measures. Encryption was promised, but not implemented. Transparency was pledged, but rarely enforced. and in the space between promise and reality, new tactics emerged. In Russia, the Tsar's agents developed a system for inserting plausible but false forum entries into opposition packets, not to change minds, but to sow doubt. In Egypt, British officers created ghost terminals, devices that looked real but were disconnected, designed to monitor who attempted to use them. In Canada, an unmarked relay station near Ottawa was discovered to be logging all outgoing posts from nearby reading rooms, storing them in wax cylinder archives. Still, people adapted. Message delays became common, but so did checksums. Small markers users added to their posts to verify authenticity. Some groups developed call and response sequences that only trusted readers would understand. Others shifted to oral relays entirely, treating the packets as conversation starters rather than gospel. And in all of this, the question persisted, not just about the power of the network, but its place. Because even as sabotage grew, so did ingenuity. A former baker in Marseille developed a heat-sensitive strip that allowed operators to detect signal tampering. A group of teachers in Kyoto trained their students to build miniature terminals using discarded parts. In Bogota, women began maintaining a backup archive of packets, carving summaries onto stone tablets for safekeeping. And somewhere in a quiet corner of Wales, the Caithness schoolhouse still opened its doors every Saturday. The packets arrived late, sometimes garbled, sometimes filtered, but they arrived, and the villagers still came, still listened, still wondered. The network had changed, had been bent, bruised, and burned, but it had not broken. It carried not just messages now, but memory, not just warnings, but whispers. And if you leaned in close enough past the noise, past the fog, past the wires twisted and frayed, you could still hear something gentle beneath it all. A question, a hope, a signal not yet lost. By the time clocks began ticking into the final hours of the 19th century, the network was no longer a novelty. It pulsed beneath cities and across the ocean floor, embedded not only in machines and institutions, but in habits, thoughts, and childhood memories. Children born in 1885 had never known a world without the feed. Their mothers had used it to post neighborhood news. Their teachers pulled lessons from remote academies in Vienna or Boston. The priest in the village chapel sent his homilies to a regional bulletin board, where other parishes could adapt them for Sunday service. In homes where bread was shared, the feed was also shared, slowly, softly, one brass terminal at a time. It had become as common as a bookshelf, and for many more sacred, it hummed beneath factories, now quieted for the night. It glowed behind library walls, spitting soft light into alleys as workers passed by after long shifts. It chattered inside embassies and schools, rail stations and cathedrals. And though it still clicked and rattled with brass gears and magnetic relays, it had become something more than mechanical, something cultural, something almost biological, a second nervous system for an age just beginning to grasp the power of shared thought. Colonial resistance movements began using it, not just to share messages, but to tell stories. Indigenous authors in the Philippines published serialized accounts of their histories, bypassing European presses entirely. In South Africa, Zulu intellectuals built networks of encrypted bulletin boards where traditional knowledge mixed with modern agricultural techniques openly debated and refined. Even in Ireland, where the British surveillance grid had once operated with near total control nodes, now flickered in homes and schools, archiving local stories oral songs, messages of quiet protest. Scientific journals transformed. Once slow-moving and reserved for elite circles, research now spread almost instantly through curated academic channels. A German chemist could upload results from a university lab in Leipzig, and within days, sometimes hours, a Scottish botanist, a French mineralogist, a Japanese engineer could offer feedback, replications, or completely new applications. The language of science changed. Footnotes became hyperlinks. Debate became conversational. Knowledge no longer moved at the speed of ships or mailbags. It moved at the speed of thought, and fiction to bloomed. The serialized novel, once a staple of Victorian magazines, found new life in the feed, but it was no longer static. Readers left comments. Some stories branched into versions. Others were shaped in real time by their audiences, with writers adjusting arcs based on live feedback from 1,000 towns and cities. One account from a Brazilian author in 1899 tells of a mystery story whose ending was decided by vote, region by region, until the final chapter carried traces of every coast, every dialect, every fear stitched into the readership. Schools especially changed. No longer only rooms with chalkboards and books. They became hubs of shared cognition. In poorer towns, 1 or 2 terminals served 100 students, each child given a brief moment to query the feed, to read from lectures archived by teachers oceans away, or to upload hand-drawn maps and observations from their farms and rivers. In wealthier districts, schools integrated terminal time into every subject. Literacy rates soared, so did curiosity. The world once learned slowly through books and sermons, now arrived in living fragments, charts, voices, translated scrolls, opinion posts from far-off lands, and slowly, quietly memory changed. Children born into the system learned not just from their parents or teachers, but from the accumulated thought of thousands, then millions. A weaver in a Yorkshire mill could recount tax law from Hanover. A fisherman in Nova Scotia could quote a passage from a Punjabi textbook on river ecology. Memory no longer belonged to the individual. It belonged to the network, shared, anonymous, and intimate at once. Privacy bent around this shift. Diaries became encrypted logs. Gossip moved faster but left trails. Pseudonyms were cherished, guarded, passed down like heirlooms. Families had house handles, names used for decades in message boards and local directories. Some users became folk legends, old moderators who mediated debates between villages, anonymous poets whose verse shaped political sentiment in cities they never visited, to be unknown yet present. This became a kind of fame. Trade changed. Shipping manifests updated in real time. Customs officials no longer needed thick ledgers or dusty backrooms. A merchant in Algiers could cross-reference Dutch tariffs within moments. Ports became quieter. Fewer shouts, fewer disputes. Just the hum of machines confirming facts already known. The market moved differently. Demand forecasts emerged. Fabric orders adapted to Parisian fashion posts. Supply chains tightened not by force, but by foresight. Even the smallest towns felt the change. Weekly digests were printed and read aloud in barns and bakeries. Peasants in the Russian countryside could read a translated editorial from a Chilean mechanic. A child in Madagascar could listen to a story posted from Denmark. Language softened, dialects blurred. The idea of a border once felt in every passport, every silence, every gap in knowledge, began to stretch, to fray, to become something less certain. The feed was not perfect. It failed often. Wires were cut, relays jammed, storms brought silence, but the habit remained, and the world it built, slowly, line by line, was unlike anything the century had planned for. The revolutions came softer, not always with flags or blood, but with quiet refusals, shared templates, knowledge placed exactly where it was needed. The pressman no longer held the final word. The minister no longer had the only book. Power thinned, thickened elsewhere, changed shape. By 1900 it was clear the world had split, not into nations or ideologies, but into timelines. One, the one we know, marched toward a century of roaring 20s and world wars, of radios and roaring engines, of industrial acceleration tempered by analog slowness. And another, this one, walked softly into a century of shared thinking, of distributed memory, of a world more connected than its machines should have allowed. Trains still ran, steam still hissed, telegraph lines still buzzed, but over them, beneath them, between them, the feed pulsed. It shaped conversation, softened propaganda, complicated power. It was never pure, never perfect, but it made the 20th century different, quieter, stranger. A little more like a whisper passed down the line, and somewhere in the soft light of a public terminal, a child asked it a question, and somewhere else a woman answered.